Good evening. Tonight, we turn to the Middle East, where ceasefire talks between Israel and Hamas have once again stalled. At the center of the deadlock is Hamas's insistence on what it calls a genuine Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Israel, meanwhile, demands disarmament and phased pullbacks, but resists a full and immediate withdrawal. This impasse is not only about military positioning, it's about legitimacy, sovereignty, humanitarian crisis, and the uncertain future of Gaza's governance. Over the next half hour, we'll explore how this situation developed, what each side wants, the role of international mediators, and where this conflict could go next. Ceasefire negotiations have been ongoing in Egypt with mediators from Qatar, Egypt, and the United States. Hamas recently submitted lists of hostages and Palestinian prisoners for exchange, an act viewed as a goodwill gesture to advance the talks. Despite that, Israeli military operations have continued, creating tension and mistrust during negotiations. Earlier proposals, such as a 45-day pause in fighting in exchange for prisoner releases, were rejected by Hamas, which argued that Israel's conditions were impossible. Hamas has also criticized proposed maps and withdrawal plans as vague and lacking credibility. At the heart of Hamas's position is the demand for a clear and verifiable Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. The group argues that conducting prisoner exchanges while Israeli troops remain in populated areas would be unsafe and politically meaningless. Withdrawal, from their perspective, is not only a military necessity but also a matter of sovereignty and dignity. Hamas leaders say they cannot accept a deal that leaves Israeli forces stationed in any part of Gaza or that leaves them vulnerable to renewed attacks once a ceasefire begins. For Hamas, disarmament is not an option. They see armed resistance as central to their identity and as their only leverage in negotiations. Their conditional acceptance of recent peace frameworks reflects this mindset, a willingness to discuss hostages, aid, and ceasefire, but only if there are firm guarantees of withdrawal and no hidden clauses allowing Israeli re-entry. On the other side, Israel insists that Hamas must be demilitarized or at least substantially weakened before any withdrawal takes place. Israeli officials argue that leaving Gaza prematurely would allow Hamas to rearm and reorganize, setting the stage for future attacks. Political realities inside Israel further complicate the situation. Hardline parties in the coalition reject what they view as retreat without security assurances. The Israeli government faces public pressure to bring home hostages, but also faces internal criticism for being too lenient in negotiations. Israel continues to view Hamas with deep suspicion, citing past ceasefire violations and resumed rocket fire as reasons for caution. Mediators from Egypt, Qatar, and the United States are attempting to bridge this divide. They are pushing for phased implementation, gradual withdrawal paired with staged prisoner releases and monitored demilitarization. The United States is particularly focused on a multi-stage framework that includes transitional governance in Gaza under international or regional supervision. Yet Washington's influence is limited by its own domestic divisions and its complicated relationship with Israel's current leadership. Regional players such as Turkey, Iran, and the Gulf states also shape the equation through their diplomatic leverage and indirect support networks. Meanwhile, the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza intensifies pressure on all sides. The United Nations and aid groups warn that hospitals, water systems, and food supplies are near collapse, and that prolonged stalemate could lead to famine. If negotiations fail, the consequences could be devastating. Renewed fighting would likely involve heavier bombardments, ground offensives, and widespread destruction. Israel could resume full-scale operations aimed at crushing Hamas's remaining military infrastructure. Hamas, in turn, could retaliate with rocket barrages or attacks targeting border regions and Israeli towns. The risk of mass civilian casualties and displacement remains extremely high. Each escalation erodes the fragile trust that mediators have spent months trying to build. There's also a risk of regional spillover. Tensions could reignite in Lebanon, the West Bank, or along maritime routes in the Red Sea. A collapse of talks would not only deepen the humanitarian crisis, but also damage the credibility of international diplomacy itself. There are several possible paths forward. The first is a phased compromise in which Israel gradually withdraws troops from specific sectors of Gaza while Hamas begins releasing hostages in stages, monitored by a joint committee that ensures compliance. Another scenario is third-party enforcement, with an international or Arab peacekeeping force overseeing withdrawal zones to prevent renewed hostilities. A third possibility is continued stalemate. Negotiations drag on without breakthrough, while sporadic pauses in fighting are brokered to allow limited aid. The worst-case scenario is complete collapse. One side accuses the other of bad faith, talks end abruptly, and a new wave of violence begins. The likelihood of any scenario succeeding depends on credible guarantees, effective monitoring, and each side's willingness to absorb domestic political backlash. Ultimately, the ceasefire remains stalled because of one core disagreement. Hamas links every element of negotiation to the question of genuine Israeli withdrawal, while Israel ties every concession to the need for security control. These two positions are fundamentally opposed, but neither side can achieve its aims without some form of compromise. For Hamas, the demand for withdrawal is tied to national dignity and the vision of self-governance. For Israel, resistance to withdrawal is tied to the fear of renewed attacks and loss of deterrence. Whatever deal eventually emerges, it will likely be fragile, partial, and politically controversial. Yet even an imperfect ceasefire could save lives and allow Gaza's shattered population to receive aid and rebuild. The alternative, prolonged war and humanitarian collapse, carries unbearable costs. As the negotiations continue behind closed doors, and each delay means more suffering on the ground, more uncertainty for hostages, and more instability across the region. The coming days will determine whether the parties can overcome their mistrust and find a formula that balances withdrawal with security guarantees. The world is watching closely because what happens next will not only shape the fate of Gaza and Israel, but could redefine the Middle East's political landscape for years to come.